I was 26 when I learned that a recipe could be stolen like a wallet, and that the thief could stand in a spotlight and call it inspiration. My grandmother Concepcion spent 70 years building a book that was not just food but memory, who taught each dish, on what occasion it was served, which woman modified it and why. She left it to me with one instruction: never sell it. The recipes are not yours. They are loans from the women who will come. Derek Holloway sold them anyway. He called them his journey, his discovery, his reinvention of tradition for the modern palate. He served my grandmother's mole to investors at $300 a plate and called it his adopted grandmother's legacy. The grandmother he invented, not the one I buried. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Paloma, and this is the story of how I cooked a celebrity chef's judgment in his own kitchen, using recipes he didn't know were incomplete. If this channel has ever made you feel less alone, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. And if you're watching because someone took what your family built and called it their own, stay until the end. I need you to hear how this ends. Here's my story. My grandmother Concepcion was not a famous cook. She was a specific cook, the kind whose food could not be separated from the hands that made it, the particular day. Reason people were gathered. She made mole negro for funerals, the kind that took 3 days and 28 ingredients because grief deserved complexity. She made tlayudas for birthdays, thin and crisp because joy deserved simplicity. She made chocolate atoll for no reason at all on ordinary Tuesdays because survival deserved sweetness. She wrote everything down, not just ingredients and methods but stories. The mole recipe began from my mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from a woman in Puebla who had no daughters and gave it to a stranger rather than let it die. Modified in 1962, when I could not find Hoja Santa and used episode instead, and the result was different but not wrong. Modified again in 1985, when your mother was pregnant with you and could not tolerate chocolate, so I used more chili and less dulce, and she said it tasted like strength. The book was leather, handmade by my grandfather before he died, its pages filled with her handwriting and the handwriting of women before her, some pages yellowed, some in pencil, some in ink that had faded to brown. It was not beautiful. It was alive. It smelled of smoke and cinnamon and the particular must of paper that has lived in kitchens. I carried it with me when I moved to Los Angeles at 22. I worked in restaurant kitchens, the kind where Mexican food was elevated, where white chefs told me my grandmother's techniques were rustic, where I chopped onions for 12 hours and went home to a studio apartment that smelled of nothing. I dreamed of a street cart, a small space, food that did not need translation. The book stayed in my backpack. I showed it to no one. It was not for display, it was for continuation, for the moment when I would be ready to add my own page, my own modification, my own story. Then Derek Holloway came to the restaurant where I worked. He was already famous then. Fusion Fire had run for 4 seasons, winning awards for its bold reimagining of global cuisines. Derek was handsome in the particular way of television chefs. Tan, teeth, the practiced humility of someone who has been told he is brilliant too many times to actually believe it, but performs belief anyway. He specialized in discovering traditional foods and making them accessible, which usually meant removing ingredients that were too difficult to source, simplifying techniques that required too much time, and adding elements that photographed well for social media. He came to our kitchen on a Tuesday, during prep service, with a film crew and a smile. I want to understand authenticity, he told my boss, who was already sweating. I want to see where the magic happens. I was in the back, breaking down chilies, my hands stained red. Derek wandered over, camera following, and asked what I was making. Mole, I said, for the staff meal, not for service. Staff meal, he repeated, as if this were charming, as if he had discovered something precious. That's where the real cooking happens, isn't it? The food you make for each other, not for customers. I didn't answer. I was tired and I did not trust men who romanticized labor they did not perform. But then he saw the book. It had fallen from my backpack, which I kept under my station, and lay open on the floor where I had dropped it while reaching for more chilies. Derek picked it up before I could stop him. What's this? He asked, flipping pages, his eyes moving too fast to actually read. A family cookbook. God, this is incredible. The handwriting alone, it's like a time capsule. It's private, I said, reaching for it. Of course, of course. He handed it back, but not before his assistant, a young woman with a phone, had taken photographs. I saw the flash, the quick movement, and I felt something cold in my stomach. But Derek was already moving on, already charming my boss, already leaving with promises to return. He didn't return. 6 months later, he published Sacred Flavors, My Journey Through Mexican Tradition. I found out from a food blogger. A friend sent me the link with a message, Paloma is this. I opened it and saw the first recipe, my grandmother's mole, the one that began with the story of the woman in Puebla who had no daughters. Except in Derek's version, it began. During my travels through Oaxaca, I was adopted by a local family who taught me their most sacred recipe. Their matriarch, a woman I came to call abuela, showed me that food is love made visible. The ingredients were almost identical. Almost. He had removed 2 chilies difficult to source in most American markets and added a tablespoon of cocoa powder for depth. The method was simplified. 3 days became 1, the constant stirring became occasional attention, the particular technique of toasting, each ingredient separately became combine and toast together for efficiency. The story was gone. The women were gone. The modifications, the reasons, the loans from generation to generation, replaced by Derek's journey, his discovery, his personal connection to a culture that embraced me. I bought the book. I read it cover to cover. 12 of my grandmother's recipes were there, plus 8 from other Oaxacan families I recognized, families who had hosted Derek, fed him, trusted him. None were credited. All were adapted and elevated. All were presented as products of Derek's immersive research and culinary intuition. The book won a James Beard Award. Derek opened a restaurant, Abuela's Table, where he served the authentic flavors of my Mexican family at $300 per person. The reviews were rapturous. A revelation, said the Times. A chef who has truly understood the soul of a cuisine, said a magazine I had once dreamed of appearing in. I called him. I still don't know why I thought this would work. Perhaps because I was 26, and had not yet learned that the system is designed to protect men like Derek from women like me. Perhaps because some part of me still believed that if I simply explained, if I showed him the book, if I told him my grandmother's story, he would understand and apologize. He received me in his office, a glass-walled room in a building that cost more than my grandmother's house had in 50 years. He smiled when I entered, the same smile from the television, warm and practiced and completely empty. Paloma, he said, as if we were old friends. From the kitchen in L.A., I remember you, the mole girl, I remember you too, I said. I placed my grandmother's book on his desk, open to the mole recipe, her handwriting next to his printed version. You took this, without asking, without credit. These are my family's recipes, my grandmother's life. He looked at the book. He looked at me, then he laughed, not cruelly, not even dismissively. He laughed the way you laugh at a child who has misunderstood something basic. Paloma, he said, traditional recipes don't have owners. They are heritage, they are human patrimony. Your grandmother didn't invent mole. She didn't invent tlayudas or chocolate atoll. She was one of thousands of women who made versions of dishes that existed for centuries. I didn't steal anything. I elevated it. I made it accessible to people who would never visit Oaxaca, who would never taste your grandmother's specific version. That's not theft, that's service. She didn't want it elevated, I said. She wanted it continued, by her family, by her descendants. With the stories, with the reasons, with the understanding that each recipe is a loan, not a product. Romantic, he said, but impractical. Food evolves, Paloma. It has to survive. Your grandmother's mole, as written, as she made it, would never succeed in a modern restaurant. Too long, too complex, too dependent on ingredients that can't be sourced consistently. What I did was preservation. I saved those flavors from obscurity, by removing the women who created them, by transcending them. He stood, moving to a window that looked over the city. I'm going to be honest with you because I like you. I remember your hands, the way you worked with those chilies. You have talent. But you're thinking like a home cook, not a chef. Recipes are tools. They're not sacred texts. And the women who made them, your grandmother, the others, they were participants in a tradition, not owners of it. He turned back to me, his smile returning. I'll offer you $5,000 as a thank you for the inspiration, and a consulting contract if you're interested in helping me develop the next book. Authenticity is challenging. Having someone with your background on the team would be valuable. I looked at him. I looked at my grandmother's book on his desk, her handwriting next to his printed words, her life next to his performance, and I understood that he was not going to apologize. He was not going to acknowledge. He was not going to change, because the system that had given him awards and restaurants and television shows was built to ensure that he never had to. I picked up the book. I left the $5,000 on his desk, and I walked out, knowing that I would need a different strategy than honesty. I opened my street cart 6 months later, Las Recetas de Concepción, painted in my grandmother's favorite color, the blue of oak-second pottery, the color she had worn to my mother's wedding. I served 3 dishes, the mole, the tlayudas, the chocolate atoll. The complete versions, with all 28 ingredients, with the 3-day process, with the particular techniques that Derek had eliminated as impractical. The price was whatever people could pay, sometimes $5, sometimes nothing, sometimes a trade, a story, a recipe from their own family, a promise to pass something on. I did not turn anyone away. My grandmother had fed the hungry without asking for payment, and I would do the same. The cart became known. Food bloggers found me, the kind who sought authenticity rather than Instagram aesthetics. They wrote about the mole, its depth, its complexity, the particular sensation of tasting something that had been built over days rather than hours. They compared it, sometimes explicitly, to Derek's version. Paloma's mole is what Derek's mole wants to be, one wrote. It is not elevated, it is grounded. It tastes like someone waited for you. Derek heard about me. I know because his assistant called, offering to collaborate, to feature my cart on the show, to help me scale my operation into something sustainable. I declined. The assistant called again, then stopped, but I was not satisfied. The cart was survival, not justice. Derek still had his awards, his restaurant, his book in stores, his narrative of discovery and elevation. I had a cart and recipes that I could not patent, could not protect, could not claim as property because my grandmother had forbidden me to sell them. What I had was knowledge that Derek did not have. The secret variations. Every recipe in my grandmother's book had 2 versions. The written one, which was complete enough to produce a good dish, and the oral one, transmitted from woman to woman, which contained the specific modification that made the dish correct, not better, not different, but correct according to the particular logic of our family's tradition. The mole's secret was a specific type of avocado leaf, added at the end, that changed the chemical balance of the sauce in a way that could not be predicted from the written recipe. The tlayudas required a specific grinding stone, passed down through generations, that created a texture impossible to replicate with modern equipment. The chocolate atoll needed to be stirred in a specific direction, counterclockwise, for the particular protein structure to develop that gave it its characteristic silkiness. These were not improvements. They were proofs of belonging. The women who knew them were part of a chain. Those who did not were outsiders, welcome to approximate but never to replicate. Derek did not know this. He had photographed the book, copied the written recipes, and believed he had captured the essence. He had not captured anything. He had taken a photograph of a house and believed he owned the land. I used this. Not directly, I could not confront him again, could not risk his lawyers, his platform, his power to define reality. I used it indirectly, by becoming the thing he needed but could not create. He came to me eventually. Not personally, through an intermediary, a talent scout who had heard about my cart and wanted to discuss opportunities. I said no. The scout returned with a better offer. I said no again. The 3rd time Derek came himself. He was different now. His restaurant had received a mixed review. The critic had praised the ambition but noted a lack of depth, a hollowness at the center of dishes that promised authenticity. His television ratings were declining. He needed something new, something real, something that would restore his reputation as a discoverer rather than a recycler. I need your help, he said, standing at my cart in East LA, surrounded by the particular chaos of a street that did not care about his fame. I need to understand what's missing, what I didn't capture. I'll pay whatever you ask. I looked at him. I thought about my grandmother, about the book, about the women whose recipes he had taken and whose names he had erased. I thought about the $5,000 still on his desk, the offer that had been not generosity but purchase, an attempt to transform theft into transaction. I'll consult, I said, but not for money, for something else. What? For the truth, eventually. He didn't understand. He nodded, eager, believing that eventually meant never, that he could absorb whatever I gave him and continue as before. He was wrong. I spent 2 years in his kitchen, not as an employee, as a consultant, paid well, given access to everything. I taught him the recipes, or rather, I taught him versions of the recipes, not the originals and not the secret variations. Something else, derived from the originals, close enough to seem authentic, but deliberately unbalanced. A chili de mas in the mole, creating heat without depth. An hour less in the cooking time, producing sauce that was flavorful but not transformative. A grinding technique that seemed correct but altered the texture in ways that were subtle but detectable to trained palates. Derek did not notice. His palate was not trained in tradition, it was trained in performance, in what impressed critics, in what photographed well. The dishes I taught him were good. They were not correct. And the difference between good and correct was the difference between food that nourished and food that merely filled. His critics noticed. The reviews of Abuela's table became increasingly mixed, overwrought, trying too hard, a chef reaching for depth he cannot grasp. Derek became desperate. He asked for more, for deeper secrets, for the particular knowledge that would restore his reputation. I gave him more of the same. Slightly different imbalances, carefully calibrated to seem like improvements while actually degrading. He served them proudly, believing he was evolving, while his restaurant declined around him. And I documented everything. Recordings of our conversations, where he admitted to adapting my grandmother's recipes. Photographs of my original book next to his published versions. Testimonies from the women of Oaxaca, women who had cooked with my grandmother, who recognized her recipes in his book, who were willing to explain the system of transmission that he had violated. I built a case. Not for court. I knew the courts would not help me, that intellectual property law does not recognize oral tradition, that Derek's lawyers would bury any lawsuit in procedural delays. I built a case for exposure. For the particular justice of making visible what had been hidden, of forcing a narrative that Derek controlled into a space where he could not control it. The opportunity came with his gala. Derek announced a dinner to celebrate the paperback release of Sacred Flavors. 200 guests, investors, editors, critics, the particular network of influence that had sustained his career. He wanted to serve the most authentic meal yet, a culmination of his journey into Mexican tradition. I suggested he invite the abuelas who inspired my work. I told him it would be powerful, a white chef honoring the women whose knowledge he had elevated. It would generate press, goodwill, the particular narrative of humility that might reverse his declining reputation. He agreed. He did not know that I had already contacted 12 women from Oaxaca, women who had fed him, who had shown him their kitchens, whose recipes appeared in his book without credit. Women who were angry, who were ready, who understood that this was their opportunity to speak. The gala was held in a converted warehouse, decorated to suggest rustic Mexico, woven textiles, clay pots, the particular aesthetic of authenticity that Derek had always preferred to actual authenticity. The guests arrived in suits and dresses, expecting performance, and they received it. But not Derek's performance. Ours. The dinner was served in 3 courses. First, the original, each abuela preparing her own recipe, the complete version, with the secret variations that Derek had never known. The mole, the tlayudas, the chocolate atoll, plus dishes from the other women whose knowledge he had taken. Each plate was introduced by its creator, who told the story of the recipe, the woman who taught it, the modifications made over generations. The guests ate in silence. The food was not elevated. It was grounded, specific, alive in a way that Derek's versions had never been. You could taste the difference, not just in flavor, but in intention, in the particular quality of food made by hands that understood they were part of a chain rather than the origin of a product. Then came Derek's version. The same dishes, prepared by his kitchen from his book, served with his usual presentation. They were good. They were not correct. And after tasting the originals, the guests could feel the difference, the simplification, the removal of complexity that Derek had called accessibility, the hollowness at the center of food that had been extracted rather than inherited. Then came the 3rd course. My version, the one I had taught Derek, the deliberately unbalanced one. The mole that was too hot, the tlayudas that were too brittle, the atoll that separated rather than silked. I served it myself, standing at the head of the table where Derek sat, and I watched his face as the guests tasted what he had been serving, what he had believed was improvement, what was actually degradation. A critic from the New York Times was there, the same critic who had written the mixed review who had been invited by Derek in an attempt to change his mind. He tasted all 3 versions. He set down his fork. He looked at me. Who created the 3rd version? He asked. I did, I said, for Derek. To teach him what he didn't know, to show him that the knowledge he took cannot be replicated by those who don't understand it's alone, not a product. I turned to the screen behind me, the screen that had been showing images of Derek's journey through Mexico, which I had replaced with my documentation. The photographs of my grandmother's book next to his printed versions. The recordings of him admitting to adaptation. The testimonies of the abuelas, in Spanish with English subtitles, explaining the system of secret variations, the ethics of transmission, the particular violence of taking what was offered in hospitality and selling it as discovery. Derek stood. He tried to speak, to explain, to perform the particular humility that had always saved him before. But the abuelas were already speaking, their voices overlapping, their stories filling the space that he had controlled for so long. They spoke of him arriving with cameras, eating their food, photographing their kitchens, leaving with recipes and never returning. They spoke of their grandmothers, their mothers, themselves, the chain of women whose knowledge he had broken by pretending it was his own. The critic wrote his review. It did not mention Derek's name in the first paragraph, unusual, in a profile of his dinner. It mentioned Concepcion. It mentioned the 12 abuelas. It mentioned me. It mentioned a system of knowledge that culinary colonialism attempts to destroy by calling it human heritage, as if humanity were a white chef on a television show. Derek's paperback sales collapsed. His restaurant closed 6 months later, for renovation, he claimed, but it never reopened. His television network did not renew Fusion Fire, citing creative differences. He attempted to sue me for defamation, but his lawyers advised against it. I had more evidence of appropriation than he had of falsehood, and the abuelas were willing to testify in court. He moved to a smaller city, opened a smaller restaurant, attempted to rebuild as a humble chef focused on his own heritage, which turned out to be Irish-American, a background he had never mentioned during his Mexican phase. He was not destroyed. He was diminished, which was worse for a man who had built himself on scale. I did not celebrate. I had learned from my grandmother that food is for nourishment, not victory, but I did continue. Las Recetas de Concepción is a community kitchen now, not just a cart. We serve whoever comes with whatever they can offer. Some pay money, some pay with stories, some pay with labor, washing dishes, sweeping floors, teaching their own recipes to whoever wants to learn. The book is gone. Not destroyed, lost, or perhaps stolen again, or perhaps simply misplaced in the particular chaos of a kitchen that is more interested in cooking than in preservation. I do not search for it. The book was never the knowledge. The knowledge is in the women who cooked with my grandmother, who cook with me now, who will cook with whoever comes after. I have a daughter. She is 3, with my grandmother's eyes and my mother's laugh and her own particular insistence on mixing ingredients that do not belong together. She helps in the kitchen, creating dishes that have no name, no tradition, no precedent. I do not correct her. I only say what my grandmother said to me, what I hope she will say to whoever comes after. Each recipe is alone. You can lend your own when you're ready. Last month, a young chef came to the kitchen. White, male, recognizable from a television competition where he had discovered Mexican cuisine. He asked to speak with me. He wanted to learn from authenticity. I looked at him. I looked at him the way my grandmother had looked at me, with the same assessment, the same possibility of rejection or acceptance. You can cook with us tomorrow, I said. But there are no written recipes. Only hands that teach you, and what you learn is not yours. It is borrowed. Do you understand? He nodded, serious, perhaps sincere, perhaps not. I do not know yet. But I will give him the chance. Because that is what we do, we who understand that knowledge only survives if it is lent, not sold. We who have been stolen from and who choose anyway to continue lending. I am Paloma. I am 35 years old. I spent years believing that a recipe could be protected, that a book could be preserved, that ownership was the only defense against theft. I learned that the defense is not ownership but continuation, not possession but transmission, not walls but doors. Always open, always lending, always trusting that the chain will hold even when individual links are broken. If someone has taken what your family built and called it their own, if they have removed your name, your story, your reason, and sold the remains as discovery, I need you to know, they have not taken the knowledge. They have only taken a photograph. The real knowledge is in the hands that made it, the voices that transmitted it, the particular understanding that cannot be copied because it lives in relationship, not in text. See you in the next story.